It's Mrs. Murray here, going to do a bit of talking about A Christmas Carol, ready for the assessment that you've got on Monday. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you with some bits and bobs on it about A Christmas Carol, and then I will be talking through a few quotes with you that hopefully will be helpful. So let's just get this okay. On beginning, there we go. Right, Christmas Carol. So what do I want to say about this? This is a lot of contextual information that I'm going to give you here. Nothing new, I'm sure you've all heard this before, but it's a bit of revision, isn't it? Because the context is so important, isn't it, to this novel? And of course, our question is about the suffering of the poor, which is a contextual theme, isn't it? So why London? Well, London changed hugely in the Victorian period due to, which I'm sure you've done in history, the Industrial Revolution. So what happened? Large numbers of people moved to the city for work. The work was very low paid. There was very little safety. They had no rights in the factories, another low level employment, no work protection, no rights, nothing to look after their health and safety. Living conditions were terrible. They were overcrowded. There were way too many people having to live in one very small home. Think about the Cratchits. There's a lot of those in a 2 up, 2 down house, aren't there? It was insanitary as well, because the sewers and toilets and things like that. The Victorians did invent sewers, but it was a long time coming. So these places were dirty and disease-ridden, and they were dark and they were dirty, and they were often very dangerous. It's not a nice place to live at that time. Dickens describes London authentically. That means it's very realistic. So the London that he describes to us is a very real London, and as it really, he shows it as it really was for the majority of people who've lived there. The majority, not the minority, to show the realities of poverty in the city, and that's why he shows us a very real London. And the thing about Dickens is he understood exactly what London was like. When he was writing a book, at night he used to go for long walks around London for hours. So all these places that he's describing will be places that he's actually seen. His audience, so who was he writing this for? Well, many poor people wouldn't have been able to read because education wasn't yet a right for all, and those who did get an education, it was expensive. Children were employed in physical work as soon as they possibly could because their parents needed the money coming into the house. They went down coal mines, they worked in factories, they worked as chimney sweeps. The girls worked in laundry houses and cleaning. All of the work was very physical. The novella was then aimed very much at the middle to upper classes because Dickens wanted to, no, that's not what I wanted to do. Dickens wanted to change their ideas about the poor and how to live their lives. This is what he wants, and this is why he's written the novel. We've been told that he was going to write a political essay to change people's minds, but instead wrote A Christmas Carol, because he knew that a story that was emotive would have more impact on his readers. So what that means is, rather than writing a very academic, dull and rather uninteresting political essay about what he felt about poverty, it occurred to him that a way better thing to do was to write a story, and an emotive story where we care about the characters and poverty becomes real. And obviously this is why the Cratchits are so important. So he knew he'd have more impact on his readers, and he knew that he would reach a far wider readership by doing it this way. But the point here is that he desperately wanted to get his message across. It was very important to him. Why was he so passionate? Well, he was born into a family of 8 children, and the family was not well off when Dickens was a child. His dad was sent to prison for debts, not because he was a criminal, but because he couldn't afford to pay his debts. And Dickens was sent to work in a blacking factory. Now, blacking is shoe polish, okay? So we know that that experience would have been incredibly for Dickens. His younger siblings went into prison with his mother and his father, but Dickens, I think he was 11 at the time, he stayed out and lived elsewhere and had to go to work to earn his living. So these experiences gave him an understanding and, most importantly, a sympathy for the poor, which is evidenced in A Christmas Carol. He would often walk the streets of London at night, and so many of his scenes are inspired by the realities of life in London during the Victorian era. He was very concerned about society's treatment of the poor and felt that they were ignored by society or treated and judged cruelly and unfairly. And of course, he was absolutely right. This isn't just, Dickens having some strange ideas. That's exactly what Victorian life was like. It was cruel. It was unfair. The working class were treated very poorly, were often working very, very hard, but even the amount of work that they did, because it was so poorly paid, it wasn't enough to get them out of poverty. Dickens recognised this, Dickens understood this, and was passionate about trying to do something about it. And his books are very accurate. We learn, as historians, have learnt so much about Victorian England through Dickens's novels. His literary style, well, a key feature of Victorian writing, and Dickens in particular, is this omniscient narrator. Now, you know that omniscient means sees all. Someone who tells the story from an all-seeing perspective. The narrator can see inside the thoughts of the characters and pass on their own opinion as well, which we often see Dickens direct address to the reader. Okay, he talks to us directly, doesn't he, the narrator? Also, the tale of redemption and the moral in the tale is another feature of Victorian literature. So obviously we know that Scrooge is redeemed because he changes his ways, doesn't he? So the Victorians liked stories about redemption. And seeing a main character change and develop as a lesson to us all that we can change too. Okay, so although our essay is about the suffering of the poor, we have to look at Dickens's message as well, because that's why he wanted to write about suffering of the poor and why he presented the suffering of the poor in the way that he did. Education. Well, Dickens believed passionately that education was the solution to poverty. That's an important phrase, isn't it, there? That education was the solution to poverty. He uses the child ignorance, and that's our extract, remember, to show how the poor are doomed to live a life of want by lack of education. Their only refuge is prison or the workhouse. And that's what he means by ignorance. He's also very critical of the ignorance of the upper classes about the poor. So there's two bits to ignorance, isn't there? So he's like Scrooge is the perfect example. He doesn't know how Bob Cratchit lives. He doesn't know anything about Tiny Tim. He doesn't know or care that he doesn't even pay Bob enough to be able to support his family. He doesn't know that, and neither would upper class members of Victorian society, that they are ignorant. But he's also talking about education, which he sees, as I say there, the solution. This will get us out of this terrible mess. Because he was keen to point out that poverty doesn't just affect the poor, but it affects the whole of society. We are all affected by poverty. The characters, ignorance and want, are described in a deliberately shocking way and a deliberately frightening to highlight that things need to change. And of course, ignorance and want are children as well. Deliberately children, because that's very emotive. And there's also the message there from Scrooge that the children in society, they suffered the most. Okay. And of course, we always associate sort of like innocence with childhood as well. So these are innocent beings that are suffering. We also know that the Victorians had a very idealised view of childhood. And to see children represented in this way would have been very shocking, would have been very disturbing to his Victorian reader. Right, we can't talk about poverty without talking about Malthus, and we'll have to talk a little bit about the Poor Law as well. So who was Thomas Malthus? Well, he was an economist, and he said that the population was growing too quickly and that the world could not cope with as many people as there were because resources would deplete and then run out, that should be, apologies, run out altogether. Malthus believed that poverty was the inevitable result of overpopulation because the worst off in society would get less and less. Dickens disagreed with Malthus and believed there was enough food to go around, but only if the rich were more generous. So Malthus believed that, and this is where decrease the surplus population comes from, of course, that you had to lose a certain percentage of your population because there simply wouldn't be enough food to go around if we didn't. And he also believed that poverty was inevitable. It wasn't something that we could get rid of. Dickens disagreed with him massively. We see the most beautiful descriptions of huge amounts of food that Dickens describes. And this is Dickens saying, there is plenty of food to go around. All we have to do is be more generous and to share. Poverty, the Poor Law, was the creation of the workhouse, the dreaded workhouse, that anyone not in work or on the streets could go to the workhouse. Lovely, but they would be treated terribly. They worked very hard. They were fed very little, and they lived in horrible conditions, and they were separated from their family, as it was supposed to be a deterrent. Right, a deterrent means to put people off going there. So you see, the Poor Law is saying, right, here's what we're going to do to help the poor, but we don't want to help the poor. Okay, we don't want to, they can only come to the workhouses. It's the very, very last thing that they can do. There was a lack of understanding about what caused poverty. People believed the poor were lazy. That was a very, very common belief amongst the upper classes. And they didn't want to sacrifice their own wealth to help the poor. And of course, we'll have a look in a bit, but all of this is demonstrated by Scrooge and his attitudes towards the poor, which again, the laziness is why the Cratchits are so important, because they're clearly not lazy. And the workhouse, look how it says here that they were separated from their family. Husbands were separated from wives. The children, if they were 7 and above, were separated from their parents. They had to work hard every day. So the 6 and unders would sit by their mother's sides while they worked all day. But the older children were even taken away from that workhouse to another site. So families were just completely separated. We can understand why people were so desperate not to go to the workhouse. And of course, once they were in the workhouse, it was very, very difficult to get out. They didn't have an address. They didn't have any money. Job opportunities under those circumstances would have been very, very difficult. So people hated the workhouse. It really was a last resort. At first, Scrooge only cares about himself. And this is emblematic of the rich in Victorian society. Emblem just means like a symbol. So we could also say it's symbolic or emblematic or even representative. Any of those words of the rich. That's who Scrooge is. He represents the rich in Victorian society. He believes that taxes pay for prisons and workhouses, and he should not be expected to support people beyond that. Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? I can't afford to make the idle merry. Remember where he says that? He exploits Bob Cratchit. He pays him a low wage. He makes him work in freezing conditions. Scrooge is afraid of being poor, though, isn't he? Because he tells Belle that. And this has made him selfish towards those in need. Now, you would think, wouldn't you, that he'd have more sympathy and more empathy for those in poverty because he's been there himself, but he doesn't. It has the opposite effect on Scrooge. He's so terrified of getting back into poverty that he's determined to keep every single penny that he earns to himself. And he wasn't on his own with that view. Maybe people weren't frightened of poverty like Scrooge, or some would have been, but this idea that what you earned, you kept to yourself. The Cratchits. Well, Dickens uses the Cratchits to show what living in poverty can be like. They are deliberately, they're cheerful, they're grateful, they're hardworking, they're moral, they're good people, aren't they? They're loving. All of these good qualities. To discredit the view of the poor as lazy, okay? Deliberately, they are so hardworking. Bob, but also Martha, goes out and works, and she describes the hours and the conditions that she works in. Bob simply couldn't be working any more hours, yet it's not enough, is it? So they're not all lazy and scavenging, and it's not like that, says Dickens. This is a typical family living in poverty. They're good people. However, he also shows that the seedier or the nastier side of poverty, when we have the description of old Joe's shop to show the horrible conditions of 19th century London. I've got some quotes to show you here, but it's the ghost of Christmas yet to come, and he shows us that poverty breeds crime. So Dickens isn't saying that all families are like the Cratchits, but what he is saying, those that do commit crime, it's poverty that's pushed them down this route. It's something that people have to do because they've got no. That should say the supernatural, sorry. Throughout the novella, it is evident in the portrayal of Scrooge and other minor characters that the supernatural are used to highlight the social injustice faced by many in London. So it's the ghosts that show us poverty, isn't it? So it's the ghost, he uses the ghost to show us poverty. Mrs. Dilber, the laundress, the undertaker's man, and old Joe, they reinforce the suffering of the poor and the lows that they have to stoop to in order to survive. All of these characters steal, old Joe doesn't, but he's the pawnbroker. So all of these characters steal from the dead Scrooge and then pawn the measly stolen goods to old Joe, who gives them very little for their troubles. So Scrooge isn't saying, oh my God, aren't these people dreadful? Look what they've done, it's awful. They stole from a dead body. He's saying, look at this. Look what poverty makes people do. Okay, there's no indication there that these people are greedy. I think he's showing us that this is how low, this is the depths that people will stoop to be able to earn a living. And the supernatural. Victorians were fascinated with the supernatural. And they loved ghost stories. They were very popular. They were hugely entertained by it. So, clever Dickens, he taps into this interest to encourage his readers to engage with his ideas. Okay, so that's why he said he was going to write a story and he was going to highlight the problems with poverty. And he goes even further than that and writes a ghost story because, again, he knows that will reach a wide audience and that the public will love it. Each of the ghosts symbolised something specific for Dickens' Christmas past, the shifting nature of memories, and how we are shaped by what we have experienced. Well, that's Scrooge, and once again, poverty. So it's his past that's made him the man that he is, isn't it? Present, there's plenty. And remember, he's sitting on all those huge amounts of food, isn't he? The ghost of Christmas present. And we have that description as well of lots of food as him and Scrooge are kind of like flying past. Dickens saying there's enough to go around. But the ghost of Christmas present, he also hides the darker side, or shows us, sorry, the darker side of poverty, because he's got ignorance and want under his robe. So he shows us, yes, there's plenty of food going around, but what about these two? And Christmas yet to come, that's about our worst fears for the future and death and how we will be judged in the end. And therefore we should be better people. And what do better people do? They help the poor. Okay, so all of those ghosts are giving us a message, aren't they? And what is the message? Well, Dickens, throughout the novella, he uses Scrooge's reprehensible or terrible or miserly behaviour, or any word you want to use there, but reprehensible means, you know, that really bad behaviour. And why does Scrooge so bad at the beginning? Are there no prisons, etc.? Because it highlights the evil, the ills, the poverty, and the social class differences. The avarice, that means greed, and the mean-spirited nature of some members of the human race. Okay, that's what Scrooge shows us. The social class difference is probably one of the biggest problems. And all of these things, it's all about poverty, isn't it? While reminding us through stave 5 that actually redemption is possible. Mankind needs to be more socially responsible. Scrooge changes. Okay, that's the message. And he changes because he's shown the error of his ways, and it's shown to him how he should behave, and Scrooge listens and he takes it on board, and he becomes a different man at the end. Right. Hopefully. Now, what I'll do with that PowerPoint is I will share that with you on Show My Homework. I've just got something else I would like to share with you now. Okay, and once again, I will share this with you on Show My Homework. It's a kind of like a graph of all the different things to do with poverty. So I will put it on Show My Homework and you can have a proper look. I'm going to zoom in and look at some of the things that we've got here. Okay, so it's all about poverty. So, living conditions. This is the quote. Like so many cesspools, disgorge their offences of smell and dirt. That's when the ghost of Christmas yet to come takes Scrooge to where old Joe's shop is. The people on that journey are described as half-naked, drunken, slipshod, ugly. Ugly words that he uses to describe them. But again, we must make this absolutely clear that Dickens is not criticising the people. He's criticising poverty. He's criticising what's driven them to this kind of behaviour. Poverty is emphasised by Joe's shop. Children suffered the most and were exploited by the rich factories and made to work long hours in appalling conditions. Somebody owned that factory. Somebody was responsible for this. A bit like Mr. Burling, isn't it? And in Inspector Calls. They were responsible, and they were responsible for this direct suffering of children. Many of these people, they ended up living in slums or cheap, overcrowded houses, and we know how dreadful the conditions were there. We've mentioned it, haven't we? Many moved from the country to the city to look for work. The population grew. This is a really nice quote. I like this one. Overcrowding led to disease, to hunger and crime. And the quote directly from the novel is, this area reeked with crime, with filth and misery, poverty. The charitable gentleman, when he tries to get some money from Scrooge, he says that many thousands are in want of common necessities. And what the charitable gentleman is saying there, these people haven't got enough for just their everyday life. He isn't even really trying to collect money to give them something nice. He's trying to collect money to give them what they need. And the streets are described as foul and narrow. And the old Joe, the laundress, etc., they've stolen possessions from a corpse, but they feel absolutely no remorse for what they've done, because they were like, well, he doesn't need it now, he's dead. Okay. Something that is mentioned in the novel, it's something you could mention, it's not a huge part, but it's this thing called Sabbatarian, I can't pronounce it. It's people who are against the not things happening on the Sabbath. Sabbatarian. It was the Victorian practice of going to church on a Sunday and resting. Now, Dickens was anti this because he believed it denied the poor the chance of enjoying their day off. All of the grocers were shut, so the one day of the week when maybe the poor could take a piece of meat like they do on Christmas Day to the bakers and have it baked, because they didn't have ovens in their houses, and they can't do it because everything's shut and everyone's got to go to church and have a day of rest. So Dickens felt that was wrong. He felt it was a restriction that was placed on the poor. So he was anti that, and Scrooge actually talks about that with the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come. He tries to tick him off for it. He said, those people of your kind are responsible for this. So also the Ghost of Christmas Present criticises the bigotry and selfishness of those who supported Sabbatheanism. And again, it's because Dickens is saying, oh, you're doing this to get at the poor, it's them who suffer. Dickens also appears to criticise the government in Stave 1, when the phantom goes past, as they might be guilty governments, he calls them. And we wonder if he's criticising the treatment of the poor and the poor law. The chains are significant, as much like Marley, they are a result of uncaring mistreatment of the poor. And that's why the poor are in chains and Marley is in chains. And the poor can't get out of their chains, can they? Social responsibility. So what's he saying here? Well, he's saying that the rich can make a difference to the life of the poor. Scrooge saves Tiny Tim, and herein lies the message of social responsibility. Okay, the poor suffered, but if somebody like Scrooge, somebody rich, got involved, their suffering could be alleviated. Without Scrooge's help, the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come shows us that Tiny Tim will die. Tiny Tim doesn't die, but only because of Scrooge's intervention, the rich. Dickens thinks the lack of education of the poor should be addressed. The Ghost of Christmas Present warns that ignorance will lead to doom. He's saying that this is the doom of Scrooge himself, but society as a whole. If we do not educate the people, Dickens is saying, it will be doomed, because we won't be able to get these people out of poverty, and that is bad for all of us. And Tiny Tim is the most obvious connection between death and poverty. And Tiny Tim is so emotive. He's absolutely created by Dickens to pull on our heartstrings. He's a poor, tiny, defenceless, innocent little child. His family can't do anything to help him. And yet, remember, he says when he went to church on Christmas Day, oh, I hope the people remembered Jesus when they looked at me, and they think about people less fortunate than themselves. God bless us all, he says. So he's this very moral little character, but so defenceless, so helpless. And it really pulls on the reader's heartstrings, doesn't it? And has an impact on the reader. Oh, ignorance and want. Now, hopefully you've looked at this this piece of text quite well. Don't remember that you can go onto YouTube and watch videos about these things as well, but this is a piece of text to go back and look at. The children are described as a monster, where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked and glared out menacingly. There's this idea that these children are dangerous, because what Dickens is saying is that they are dangerous. Want is dangerous. Ignorance is dangerous. And he describes the children as yellow, makes them sound diseased, meagre, ragged, scowling, and wolfish. Wolfish particularly is a word that you'd want to zoom in on. It makes them sound predatory. It makes them sound dangerous. A wolf is dangerous. But prostrate means they're bowed down, so they're humble, because they can't be anything else, can they? But these are horrible words to describe children, ugly words, but it's poverty, ignorance of the people, ignorance of the poor that's being criticised here, with ignorance just meaning lack of knowledge. The suggestion is that these traits are the creation of society from the way that we treat the poor. We have made this happen, Dickens is saying. The children are the children of mankind. Now the point is there, we all own them. They're not children of poverty, they're children of mankind, because we are all responsible for them, and we are all responsible for what's happened to them. They're described as horrible, and from the folding of its robe, the ghost of Christmas present brought two children, wretched, abject, that means no pride, frightful, hideous, and miserable. And although he's attributing those adjectives to ignorance and want to the children, that's what he's saying, isn't he, about poverty as a whole. And then a few bits about the poor law. We're just going back over what we've said. Conditions were made so terrible, only those who desperately needed it would go there. And many would rather have slept on the streets, would have rather been homeless, even in the winter, would rather have been on the streets than have gone to the workhouse. That's how they felt about it. And the charitable gentleman, he says that many would rather die, doesn't he, than go to the poor, the workhouse. The poor were given food and clothes in exchange for several hours of manual labour each day. When I say several hours, I think we're talking about 10 to 12 hours a day. Manual labour is hard work, hard labour, with very, very little food. If the people wanted help, they had to go to the workhouse to get it. There was nowhere else for them to go. And what we're talking about here is the 1834. It was an amendment, a change to the poor law. And it was designed to reduce the cost of looking after the poor, as it stopped money going to the poor, except for exceptional circumstances. And this Poor Law Amendment Act was based upon the thoughts of Thomas Malthus. And his views were taken into account, this idea that there's not enough to go around. Families were split up, we've said that. And people had to wear a type of uniform and follow very strict rules. And they lived on a diet of watery soup and bread. It sounds like a prison. And the suggestion there is that the poor are being punished for being poor, okay? Dickens goes as far as possible to show how cold and unforgiving Scrooge is to lower class men, to Bob. Dickens creates an extensive allegory which delivers his message to the public. An allegory is a story with a moral message. Dickens had his own experience of poverty. He was annoyed and upset about the way that society did not care for the poor. He uses Scrooge as a symbol of the wealth and aristocratic members of society that are ignorant to the lives of the poor. It's not, I think some of them, it wasn't even just that they didn't care, it was that they didn't know. They had no idea that this was happening in society. Scrooge shows his uncaring attitude to the poor during his lengthy tirade that he gave to the charitable gentleman. And I've got those words somewhere. Through his tirade, he shows his ignorance and his neglect towards the poverty-stricken members of society. He says, are there no workhouses? Are there no prisons? Is the treadmill still in full working order? Okay, all of the horrible things that the poor had to go to, he thinks, well, that's perfectly acceptable. He says, I can't afford to make idle people merry. So Scrooge himself subscribes to that belief, doesn't he, that the poor were lazy. Dickens, using Scrooge, calls for a moral change in the wealthy. They've got to think differently. He brings to life the two traits that mankind inherits: ignorance of the wealthy and the want of the poor, but also the ignorance of the poor as well, because without education, how can they get out of poverty? Metaphorically, ignorance and want are the children of mankind. As the children of mankind, they represent the traits that filter through the generations of life because of the poor quality of life that cannot change. And the reason it cannot change is because of the negligence of the wealthy. So nothing is being done to make life better for these two metaphorical children. Scrooge asks the ghost if they were his, and he replies, they are man's. And this communicates the message that Dickens is trying to deliver to society, that the wealthy must change their ways in order for the betterment of society. Okay. I would like it very much if there we go, it's smaller again. Marley, and we could mention this, couldn't we, that he warns Scrooge to take responsibility for those around him. Marley has learned his lesson, but it's too late for Marley. And he says, mankind was my business. And you know, he gives Scrooge this chance of redemption, the chance to change his ways, doesn't he? Rich versus the poor. Scrooge and the Cratchits act as binary opposites. They are completely different. We could say that we have the behaviour of Scrooge juxtaposed against the behaviour of the Cratchits, couldn't we? Fred explains how Christmas had not made him richer financially, but emotionally and spiritually. Scrooge is rich in wealth, but poor in family and emotions. And the Cratchits are rich in family and emotions. Can't eat family and emotions, though, can you? And I think that's why his message becomes a lot sort of like sterner towards the end. As rich in family as the Cratchits are, it doesn't put food on the table. The Cratchits are poor, but appreciate what they have. They don't need, well, they do need money, I would say. They're emotionally rich. And Fezziwig is shown he's rich emotionally, and he uses his wealth to make others happy when they have the party. So I think, you know, that the thing is with the Cratchits, and I've got some more about them here, that, yes, I think the message with the Cratchits, because I know someone said to me the other day, how do the Cratchits fit into this? Because they don't really suffer. Well, they are suffering, they do suffer, they haven't got enough. But Dickens does present them in this very positive light. He does suggest that they're very rich in terms emotionally, they've got family, they've got one another, and they love each other. But the important thing about the Cratchits is that they show the upper classes what poverty is really like, because they have this horrible view that they were all lazy and immoral and deserved to be poor. And this is why Dickens presents the Cratchits to us in this rather exaggerated fashion. It's to show that these are hard-working, decent people and that their attitude must change. The Ghost of Christmas Present warns that if things don't change, if these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die. And the Cratchits continue to live in poverty. Tiny Tim will die. So somebody wealthy has got to make that different. And positive descriptions of their attire. But Peter's wearing that second-hand coat, isn't he? But he's described as gallantly attired. But it just shows us how proud Peter is in his enormous collars. But the Cratchits are the face of poverty in the novella, because they're the emotive ones that we become invested in as a reader. They're the ones that we're encouraged to care about and worry for. Mrs. Cratchit, remember, dresses in ribbons, but they represent her desperation to look respectable. She's brave in ribbons, he says. He says that ribbons are cheap. And their pudding is described as small. Nobody said or thought it was a small pudding for a large family. It would have been a flat heresy to do so. Any Cratchit would have blushed to think of such a thing. It's a very small pudding, but they don't criticise, do they? And it just shows us again that they don't have much. Now, lastly, last little bit I'm going to talk about is Scrooge and the charitable gentleman and Scrooge himself. So Scrooge says, there is nothing on which it is so hard as poverty. That's at the beginning, isn't it? He exploits and he mistreats Bob Cratchit. Okay, there's no doubt about that. I think it's very interesting that at the end of the novella, the novel, Scrooge gives Bob a pay rise. He doesn't shower him with money and gifts. He gives him what he needed, a fair wage for a fair day's work. And so Dickens here isn't saying, oh, everybody's just got to go out and give lots of money to the poor. That's ridiculous, isn't it? What he is saying is pay them what they're worth, pay them what they earn, pay them fairly, pay people enough that they can support themselves and their own families. And that's why Bob is so symbolic, isn't he, about the suffering of the poor. And then he says this terrible, terrible thing, doesn't he, when he's talking to the charitable gentleman. He suggests that they should die. He says, you know, it will decrease the surplus population. It's so callous. It's so cruel. This idea that people can't afford to look after themselves. Well, do us all a favour and die. And of course, his ideas come from Malthus. This is where it's come from. But you dig in with this, look at the word surplus, extra, not needed. And I think, and I always say, that Tiny Tim becomes the face of the surplus population in Scrooge's mind. He realises the cruelty of that awful thing that he said. And, you know, he doesn't want Tiny Tim to die, and Tiny Tim would have died because he's just surplus population. Again, when he's talking to the charitable gentleman, oh, the poor law's in full vigour then, he says. He's being sarcastic. Oh, for a minute I was thinking the poor law wasn't working anymore. He's pretending that he's absolutely shocked and astonished that they've even asked him for money. Kind of, how dare they? He isn't interested or concerned in the plight of the poor at all. Further than this, he believes that his taxes pay for the prisons and the workhouses. So why should he donate money to charity? Are there no prisons? He says. I've paid my taxes. What on earth do you want me to give more for? And the use of the word prisons very much suggests that the poor need to be punished, because that's what we do to people in prisons. We punish them because they've done something wrong, they've behaved badly. And to suggest that the poor should be treated in the same way, like Dickens's father, is horrible, isn't it? Dickens' own childhood experience of poverty obviously influenced him, and we know he had to work very hard for financial security. And Belle explains to us, doesn't she, that Scrooge lives in fear of poverty, much like Dickens himself. She goes on to explain how he is captivated by gain and hoping to escape the sordid approach of poverty. So even Scrooge's horrible attitudes are caused by the suffering of the poor, by poverty. Everything he does goes back to that. I think I've looked at all of those with you. But what I'll do is put this on Show My Homework so you can have more time to have a look. So in terms of this essay, obviously you're going to start with your big idea in your assessment, aren't you? About the suffering of the poor and how passionate Dickens was about it. You know that all of the characters are examples of Dickens using those characters to present ideas to his reader about the poor. We talk about the Cratchits and how they represent the hard-working poor and how they're designed to change the attitude of the rich, that the poor were all greedy and lazy and immoral. Obviously, your ignorance and want extract is vital. It's got some fantastically rich imagery in there that we've just talked about, some beautiful words to go in and analyse. So you're going to be writing a lot about that and his message. You can talk about how he treats Bob and the Cratchits Christmas briefly. And then I do think, you must talk about Scrooge's incident with the charitable gentleman. And all of Scrooge's quotes there are really important. Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? I can't afford to make idle people, idle meaning lazy people. Is the treadmill, still in operation? All of that is important. Look again at those words, because remember, Scrooge's character is created by Dickens to represent the upper classes. Scrooge's opinions are what Dickens is trying to persuade us against. And also have a look at the end. There's not a huge amount there, but there's some lovely quotes where he describes the area in which old Joe's shop is, and he shows us this horrible, dirty, disgusting area of London, and the way people have to live because they've got no choice, and the terrible things that poverty drives people to. Poverty breeds crime. Okay, I'm going to put all of that on to share my homework for you so that you can have a look at it in your own time. And I hope you have a bit of a break over the weekend, but I also hope that you have a little listen at this and have a look at the resources on Share My Homework. And all I can say is best of luck for Monday. You know my email, so if you need to ask me a question, please do. Email's better because I'm not always on Share My Homework over the weekend. But thank you for listening. It's much appreciated, and I'll see you next week. Bye.